Well, hello, Faith family, and thank you for joining me on the Daily Connection. It's a time when we get together in the Word, and more importantly, the Word gets into us. So this week, we're dealing with the topic of avoiding the pitfalls of temptation. Brother Aaron started us off yesterday in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 5. Now today, Paul is going to provide some practical examples from the Old Testament that should alert us and warn us in terms of the general temptations that we all tend to face. So I want us to start here in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 6, and read through verse 10. Now these things took place as examples for us, so that we will not desire evil things as they did. Do not become idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to party. Let us not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in a single day 23,000 people died. Let us not test Christ, as some of them did, and were destroyed by snakes. And don't grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroyer. So it's almost like Paul creates this catalog of examples. And it's funny because if we will go ahead and read verse 11, it's like we have two bookends. Verse 6 says, this took place as an example. Verse 11 says, these things happened as an example. So in between these two bookends, you got volume 1 of they did this, volume 2 they did this, volume 3 and volume 4. But he's very calculated in the things he talks about because there are a multitude of examples from Israel and their time in the Exodus on throughout the Old Testament that he could have used to deal with various sins and temptations. But he chooses these 4 specifically because they relate directly to the context of what the Corinthian believers were struggling with. And also, if we'll be honest with ourselves, they address some of the same temptations that we deal with probably on a daily basis. First of all, starting with the idea of don't become idolaters. In this case, he's referencing probably Exodus chapter 32, a story we're very familiar with where Moses has been on the mountain. The people are like, well, we don't have a leader. We need something to worship. And Aaron's like, well, give me your jewelry. And by his definition, he threw it in the fire and this came out. We know he formed and fashioned it. And what they're probably doing is falling back into a pattern that they had learned in Egypt, maybe even fashioned a god much like one that they had in Egypt that looked like a calf, a golden calf. And you say, well, okay, in Corinthian times, idols were common. You would see idols all over the place, dedicated to, in some cases, to the worship of Aphrodite, in other cases, a worship of a more localized god. And so idols were not that uncommon. And of course, if you're familiar with the letter of the Corinthians, you know that sacrificing meat to those idols was very common, to the point where that meat would then come back into the meat market and be sold at a cheaper rate. And so Paul had to deal with that as well. But the whole point in this is that we all have the temptation, if you will, to ascribe loyalty and love and priority to things that are not God. Now, God may bring those blessings into our life and we are to enjoy those blessings. But when the joy of the blessing supersedes the joy of serving and worshiping the one who gives the blessing, then it becomes idolatry. For instance, God blesses you with a great job, job benefits, great pay, everything is good. But more and more that job is demanding more and more of you, more of your time, more of your attention. And before you know it, you're not having your quiet time in the morning. You haven't been to worship and you don't know when. You're not fellowshipping with fellow believers. You're getting disconnected in a way. Well, guess what? That's an idol. You say, well, do I quit my job, Brent? Well, I'm not in a position to give you that counsel, but I am telling you this. Until God is once again supreme in your life, you have an idol that is superseding Him. And He won't stand for it, by the way. If you're a genuine believer, He'll discipline you that, and God may take care of that job for you. Or maybe it's a recreation. Maybe it's another area of your life. My point is this. Anytime Paul says, do not become idolaters, he doesn't literally say don't fashion idols and position them in a place where you worship them. He's saying do not be, and it's a command, do not position anything ahead of God. The second one is kind of connected. Verse 7 says, verse 8, let us not commit sexual immorality. Notice at the end of verse 7, he says, they got up to eat, drink, and party. The word party there is translated dance in some situations, but really the idea being presented is basically an orgy, an uncontrolled, unmitigated sexual orgy. And it's fascinating because he then transitions right into verse 8 and says, let us not commit sexual immorality. The situation he's referring to there is where the people had begun to mingle in numbers, had begun to mingle with the Moabites, and they begin to adopt some of their practices, and the men had begun to have relations with many of their women and following them in immorality to the point where God brought judgment on that. And the only way it ended was by Phinehas, one of Aaron's sons, taking the lead on that and killing one of the men while it was happening, and then God subsided his judgment. But the point is that we can make an idol out of sex. We can make our culture has done that. Our culture has so elevated that in terms of selling clothing, selling everything seems to have some sort of a sexual undertone to it. And we're not immune to that. We're part of the culture. And if we're not careful, we'll fall right into that pattern. We'll be tempted into those unhealthy desires that result in all kinds of destructive behaviors. First, in the private sector, might be behind a screen, but then ultimately might show up in infidelity, unfaithfulness, you name it. Thoughts that are not healthy. We begin to erase boundaries that we had set up as protectors that are healthy boundaries. But we need those. Paul says, let's don't do that. Number 3, he says, let's not test Christ as some did and were destroyed by snakes. In that case, you had a group responding to God dealing with a revolt, and they were murmuring against Moses and Aaron, saying, you're the reason why this happened. So they were murmuring against God's leaders, and that ultimately was a murmuring against God, and God brought judgment for that. And so there again, we have to be careful. It's not that the leaders of the church are above being approached and above answering questions, but when it's a constant murmur, when it's a constant complaining, then Paul says, watch out, because you're getting into the same pattern that they did, complaining against God's leadership, which was ultimately a complaint against God because they were leading the people according to God's will and purpose. Then you need to expect that God's going to bring judgment and discipline for that. Paul says, be careful of that. Let's not do that. And number 3, don't grumble. And maybe this is the one that's the hardest because we're surrounded by so much negativity. Apparently someone has convinced the news media that negativity sells. I long for the days of Paul Harvey where he would tell his beautiful stories, and it was always a story of encouragement and a story of inspiration and someone going through a difficult season, but ultimately that season makes them a better person, builds character, brings about the good for all these others. I long for those days of hearing that voice because it seems like every time we turn on the television set, it's something negative. And you know what? We're not immune to that. If we're not careful, we can even come to our campus on Sunday and we start complaining that, a paint color doesn't look good, there's dings on the wall, we don't like this, I don't like that, it's cold, it's hot, all these different things. We begin to complain, begin to murmur. God's not pleased by that. God finds no joy in our murmuring and our complaining. Especially when we come together for worship. When we come together to worship, we come together to celebrate who He is. We come to celebrate what He's done. We come to celebrate the fact that He, in His wisdom and in His grace, has employed us in doing that. So we have to guard against that as well. So I want you to think about this. Do an evaluation. Just a quick evaluation. I'm not telling you to take a long period of time, but do an evaluation. And ask yourself the question, have I fallen prey to one of these temptations? Have I created idols in my life? Is there something in my life that is completely occupying my time, my talents, the resources God blessed me with? If there is, you've got an idol. Am I being lured into relationships or into certain things at work that are clearly violating boundaries that I set up in terms of how I interact with the opposite sex? Or am I becoming obsessed and find my eyes wandering? There may be a temptation towards sexual immorality. On and on we can go this, but use these 4 as kind of a guide, as a general categorization, if you will, of pitfalls that maybe are there and you don't even realize it right now. But I tell you, one way you can rest assured you can know is by spending time in prayer, praying the prayer of David in Psalm 51. Search me, O Lord, know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts. Reveal to me anything that's contrary to your way. And I may be wrong on my reference, but I know it's a prayer in the Psalms that's prayed. So maybe pray those words and open yourself up to complete and full revelation of what God would show you in that. Because as you do that, God not only reveals, but He then guides you to having, number 1, repentance. Number 2, reconciliation with Him first, that relationship restored, then maybe a relationship with others. And then lastly, you're now restored. Reconciling, you're restored to be able to serve him faithfully, being able to worship him fully, and being used by him to go out and live sent.